Previously on Break Cycles. 24 days have passed since my departure, and I have traveled over 5,000 miles. Predominantly, I have been couch surfing or camping. On day 24, I was camping just beyond the Alaskan border, so the following day, I finished my final trek up the Alaskan Highway and arrived at Fairbanks, Alaska. I took a couch surfer who lived just outside the city center. Now, I'm not very familiar with Fairbanks, so when I arrived at the hostess house, I was surprised to see how remote it was, and it was only 5 miles from the city center. I was given my own guest cabin, and I was introduced to the outhouse, where I can do my business. Now, the outhouse, for those that have never used it, it's basically a little shed with a pit toilet that you find in many campsites. This is not something I'm unfamiliar with. But the amount of mosquitoes and bugs was new to me, and there was no door on it. So, yeah. After I settled in, I joined the host in his main log cabin where there is water. But there is very limited water because the water is hauled in on a massive tank on the back of the host's pickup truck. So there's no city water running to the house. Needless to say, there isn't a nice long hot shower after a day's ride. The next day I got up and I was surprised that there was an REI right near the center of town. So I rode there just to take a look and grab a sticker to put on my luggage case. When I came out of REI, I met Daniel, another motorcyclist who was on a Honda Shadow. He was debating whether he would go on the Dalton Highway because he was on street tires and a cruiser motorcycle. I ended up convincing him to go along with me, but he can turn around whenever he decided it was too much. The Dalton Highway is mostly gravel, and while there are parts paved, most of the paved sections are in the beginning of the 414 miles. So me and Daniel took off from Fairbanks and first arrived at the entrance sign of Dalton Highway. Then we continue to the Yukon River camp. For the majority of the day, the roads are very well paved. There was some dirt road, but most of the roads are very well paved. And the riding was a pretty easy highway cruising. And we had a pretty good campsite as well. The next day, we went on our way. The roads were surprisingly well paved. And we rode through some of the most epic scenery with the Alaskan pipeline following us towards the Arctic Ocean. Unfortunately, the paved road ended very soon after, and the pace of our riding became more and more apparent. Since I'm riding a dual sport with proper off-road tires, I was going much faster than Daniel is feeling comfortable going. So we did try to stay together for a little bit, but eventually it just didn't work out, and Daniel ended up turning around as the gravel road got worse and worse, and I continued on my own. I continued on and came across Attican Pass, and this was like the big mountain pass before you cross over to the Arctic Circle. And this is a very interesting pass because before the pass, the weather was pretty mild. 50 degrees Fahrenheit, about 10 degrees Celsius. Pretty consistent in Fairbanks, and honestly pretty consistent throughout the Alaskan Highway. There's only a few sections of it that was slightly colder, but the weather was not that bad for the summer. When I came to the pass, the temperature dropped dramatically. And when I first approached the mountain pass, it had just finished snowing. But you couldn't tell that it had just finished snowing because the mountain faces always had snow and the ground was always dry. So you wouldn't think that it was any different than what I was riding on at the time. But it did just finish snowing. So when I came up on the first turn up onto the mountain pass, I almost washed out. My rear slid out and I tried to hold on to the bike, and luckily it straightened out, but I didn't expect that there was snow on the ground. What's even more surprising is that after Attican Pass and the remainder 100 mile to the Arctic Ocean stays the same temperature that is on the pass, which is around below 30 degrees or below 30 degrees Fahrenheit or below 1 degree Celsius the entire way for the rest of the trip. So right after Attican Pass, there was a roadwork section I had to stop at. When I pulled up on the stop and saw the people working on the roadwork, I figured I can just flip my visor up and get more airflow into the helmet. And as soon as I flip my visor up, I see this black cloud moving towards me in a very scary speed. And before I could even close the face shield down, I realized that they were mosquitoes, like horrifying amount of mosquitoes that they looked like clouds. And they were gigantic, gigantic mosquitoes. They were like this big and they were like everywhere. And before like I can even put my helmet visor down, like they were flying into my visor. I jumped off my bike. I took the helmet off, swinging, swatting as fast as I can, and then put my helmet back on and close the face shield, and then like slowly walk back to my bike. By the time I got to Death Horse, it was already like 10 p.m. It was blistering cold, and since I had been riding since 8 a.m., I was also super exhausted. But because how close we are to the poles, the sun is always shining, so it always looked like daytime. I looked around and saw that there was literally nothing around. There's one small store, and then there's like one trailer. The rest were like all like oil rig, like machines and things for people doing the oil rig. That there's only one trailer which is for tourists, and it was at a tune of $200 a night for an accommodation that is worse than like a rundown hostel. And in addition to that, there was on the news that there was potential storm that's going to come through the mountain range, which will block the path to go down towards Coldfoot and Fairbanks, maybe for like a day, maybe even two. So, like an idiot, I decided that I was going to ride back. So I gassed up and turned around after taking my obligatory photo instead of the Death Horse sign. And it was around 1 a.m. when I arrived at Atticum Pass. Here, I thought I was the only idiot to do this, but I happened to meet another guy who also thought of the same bright idea, so we ended up riding together all the way to Coldfoot. By 4 a.m. in the morning, we arrived at Coldfoot. You can see that it's still bright out. I tried to go to sleep in my tent, and I had no luck. I couldn't fall asleep, so after 3 hours of tossing and turning, I got out of the tent and decided I was going to keep riding. Ironically, the guy who rode with me throughout the night also couldn't sleep, so we decided to pack up and just ride back into town. What can go wrong, right? No sleep, 24-hour stop, non-stop riding, continue on. What could possibly go wrong? So on day 28, I left Coldfoot, and about 30 minutes into the ride, I came to a very slight right turn. And it's not really like a turn, it's just the road kind of veered to the right. And as the road veered to the right, I noticed only when I'm already in the gravel that they just maintained this road, and they threw down fresh gravel on the road. And I was going way too fast already. I was already in the gravel. And I started slipping and sliding, and for 2 or 3 seconds I was hitting the brake, trying to slow down, and I was sliding closer to the edge. And for the left side edge, there was like a 15-foot drop off the road. So I was trying to avoid that, and I was just sliding. My rear was just like completely sliding as I was hitting the brakes. And as I get closer and closer to the edge, I panic and I just grab the front brakes. I was like, I can't stop. As soon as I grabbed the front brakes, I washed out, went headfirst into the gravel, and then the bike cartwheeled over my head. And I must have shaved off majority of the speed, and I also must have, landed pretty tactfully, probably from like my martial arts. Like when I'm falling, I'm like rolling properly. I didn't have a scratch on me. No injury, no scratches, nothing other than just a broken lens on the GoPro cover case. The bike, well, that's another story. I had a yard sale with all my stuff all over the road. My right pannier was completely ripped open. The frame of the bike, as you can see here, is completely twisted. The frame was so twisted that the rear tire was hitting the exhaust. If I hit any kind of bump and the suspension pushes up, it will hit the tire will hit the exhaust. And my windshield was also cracked in like 3 pieces. The handlebars and forks were on the line, but that's pretty typical when you go down, and it's easily adjust. And luckily they weren't bent. The guy who was riding with me was both terrified and confused how I did not get injured at all, seeing how bad the bike cartwheeled. I used some spare straps and pulled the panniers into shape, and then threw my stuff in there, and then kind of rode like super slow into town so that I don't cause any more damage. I called my first host. The first host in Fairbanks recommended me to a friend of his and that can host me and maybe help me. So I stopped by his place, and it happened to be a salvage yard. He had an old international dump truck frame sitting in the back. So I borrowed a few ratcheting straps from him, and with some help from him, I stripped my bike down to as far as I can, and with a block of wood and hammer and some ingenuity with this frame, this giant metal frame from this international dump truck, I was able to straighten out the frame enough before putting all the stuff back on it. Now, next morning, I thanked my host and left. And there was only one machine shop in town that was open. So I went to that machine shop, and this guy helped me like straighten out the case with some careful tapping and welding. And I was really surprised how quickly he was able to take this like completely twisted aluminum, back into a functional looking shape. And once the case was repaired, I went to the first couch surfer that I was spending in Fairbanks, and I stayed there for another night. And he actually taught me how to replace the front windshield, or repair the front windshield. I drilled a ton of different holes on the cracked pieces, and then used chicken wire to hold them together, and then lather in like liquid epoxy, and then just wait till it dried the next morning. And it looks ugly and unorthodox, but it worked like a charm, and I headed out the next day with my bike fixed. The next day, I decided that I would ride the Dalton Highway, which is south of Fairbanks, and it was a short ride. And at one point during a roadwork passing, I ended up dropping the bike in the roadwork ditch. So it was very embarrassing, and I was probably still really shaken up from the gravel. So when I was riding through the roadwork, there was a section of gravel, and then when I got on there, I just like totally panicked, and then I ended up dumping the bike. It was embarrassing. But eventually I got past it, and on the way I met Lee, who was from Seattle. He was riding a BMW GS. He was just doing a casual summer break ride up to Alaska and back. And we decided to ride together and camped out at Tango Lake. I found out through Lee that I could have stayed at Fairbanks University, which was only 5 miles from the couchsurfing host. And because it's in this town center and the university have running water, hot shower, and a flushing toilet. And I would have just been able to stay there for like only a few dollars. If you know, you know. And if you don't, well, yeah. So, through our conversation, Lee tells me that he has made this trek up to Alaska many times, and he recommended that we visit Valdez, Alaska, since it was my first time, and I happily agreed to it because I have no idea where I'm going. So, we headed down to Valdez. The road was very well paved, and the scenery was such a contrast to Dalton. I mean, going down to Valdez was lush greenery, waterfalls, glaciers. It was so serene. Before we got to Valdez, we stopped at a salmon gulch, which is where they farm the salmon. You can see the seal feasting on the salmon. So after we arrived at Valdez, we had a fantastic meal. There was surprisingly a lot of options for food downtown. And after lunch, we visited the Valdez Glacier and camped just to the west of the glacier. As you can imagine, we were like 200 yards from the glacier. The campsite is just like off to the side. And it was freezing cold. The following day, we rode out of Valdez and headed towards the border of Alaska. We camped out at Thompson Eagle Claw Motorcycle Park, and this is a very famous motorcycle campground in Alaska. This is like an obligatory stop for most people riding motorcycle up to Alaska to stop at this campground. The campground was made for motorcyclists with many old vehicles and lodging options and hostel-like stations where like there's cooking, there's shower, there's bathroom. Like it's everything you need as a motorcyclist at a campsite. As I rode in, I was surprised to find, hey, Jeff was there at the same campground at the same time. So I showed him my crash damage. We shared some experiences, and it was his first day in Alaska. The campsite host is an avid motorcyclist as well, and he cooked a very hearty seafood meal for everyone staying at the campsite. It was definitely a very comfortable experience, and it was like such a community when you're there. The following day, me and Lee headed out of Alaska and camped out at Kulane Lake. Again, amazing camp spot. I did pass by Kulane Lake on the way up, but I didn't know about this camp spot, and Lee knew all the best spots because he's done this trip a few times. So I kind of just let him take the lead on all the spot to camp, and he didn't disappoint. He knew all the good spots. Finally, on day 34, we arrived in Whitehorse. At this point, I noticed that my rear tire is pretty worn out due to riding on the chip seal service. So I started looking for tires. And let me tell you, tires in Canada are expensive. They are literally twice the price of the same tire in the USA. And on top of that, I couldn't find one that fit my bike in Whitehorse. So although the tire wasn't terrible at this point, I could still ride on it. I was concerned about not being able to find a tire for the bike when I really needed to replace it, and I also didn't want to pay double the price for the same tire that I got back in the States and buy a tire that I don't want. So next time on Break the Cycles, I share with you some of my favorite photos coming down the Cassiar Highway in Banff National Park.